King Ahab thought he could outsmart a prophecy, but he was wrong.
For 3 years, the borders of Israel and Aram were silent. No swords clashed, no blood watered the hills of Gilead. But in the ivory palace of Samaria, King Ahab was restless. Peace felt like a shackle. He stood on his balcony, eyes fixed on the distant heights of Ramoth-Gilead. "It belongs to us," he whispered, his voice a low growl. The city was a strategic jewel, stolen by Aram, and the insult festered in Ahab's heart like an old wound. When King Jehoshaphat of Judah arrived in royal procession, Ahab saw his chance. He didn't see a brother king. He saw a battalion. During a lavish feast, amidst the smell of roasted meats and expensive wine, Ahab leaned in. "Will you go with me to take back our city?" Jehoshaphat, a man of God but prone to dangerous alliances, didn't hesitate. "I am as you are," he replied. "My people are your people." The pact was sealed in wine, but Jehoshaphat felt a cold shiver. He looked at Ahab's eager, hungry face and felt the weight of the spirit. "First," Jehoshaphat added, his voice steadying, "let us inquire of the word of the Lord." Ahab smiled, a thin, predatory curve of the lips. "I have 400 prophets who will give us the answer you seek." But as the sun set over Samaria, the silence of the last 3 years felt less like peace and more like a held breath. The threshing floor near the gate of Samaria was transformed into a theater of madness. On 2 golden thrones sat Ahab and Jehoshaphat, draped in majestic robes. Before them, 400 men began to chant. It started as a low hum, then escalated into a deafening roar. They danced, they shook, they fell into trances. "Go up!" they screamed in unison. "The Lord will deliver it into the king's hand." One man, Zedekiah, stepped forward. He held up 2 massive horns of forged iron, gleaming cruelly in the sun. He lunged and thrust the air with them, his eyes wide with a manic fire. "With these," he bellowed, "you shall gore the Arameans until they are consumed." The crowd went wild. The atmosphere was electric with the promise of victory. It was exactly what Ahab wanted to hear. It was a symphony of yes, but Jehoshaphat sat motionless. He watched the sweating, screaming prophets and felt a hollow ache in his chest. This wasn't the voice of the living God. It was an echo chamber of Ahab's own ego. He leaned toward Ahab, his voice cutting through the noise like a knife. "Is there not here another prophet of the Lord of whom we may inquire?" Ahab's face darkened instantly. The celebration died. He gripped the arms of his throne until his knuckles turned white. "There is still one man," Ahab spat, "but I hate him. He never prophesies anything good about me. Only disaster." "Let not the king say such things," Jehoshaphat urged. Reluctantly, Ahab signaled an official. "Bring Micaiah, son of Imlah, quickly." Deep in the bowels of the palace, the iron door of a dungeon creaked open. Micaiah sat in the dark, the smell of damp stone and stale bread his only companions. He was thin, his eyes adjusted to the gloom, but his spirit was unbroken. As the guards led him through the blinding sunlight of the courtyard, the official whispered a warning. "Look, all the other prophets are predicting success. Make sure your word is like theirs. Speak favorably." Micaiah stopped. He looked at the official with a gaze so piercing it felt like a judgment. "As surely as the Lord lives," he said, his voice raspy but firm, "I will say only what the Lord tells me to say." He was led before the 2 kings. The 400 prophets fell silent, watching the man in rags stand before the men in gold. Ahab looked down from his throne, his voice dripping with forced casualness. "Micaiah, shall we go to war against Ramoth-Gilead, or shall we refrain?" Micaiah didn't blink. He knew the cost of the truth. He looked at the iron horns, the angry king, and the expectant crowd. The air was thick with the scent of a coming storm. Ahab in the eye and mocked him with his own desire. "Go up and triumph," he said, his voice dripping with heavy sarcasm. Ahab lunged forward, his face turning a dark, bruised red. "How many times must I make you swear to tell me nothing but the truth in the name of the Lord?" Micaiah's smirk vanished. The air in the courtyard seemed to thin, turning cold. "I saw all Israel scattered on the hills," Micaiah whispered, his eyes looking past the king, "like sheep without a shepherd. And the Lord said, 'These have no master. Let each one go home in peace.'" Ahab turned to Jehoshaphat, his voice a hiss of validation. Did I not tell you? He never prophesies good for me, only disaster. But Micaiah wasn't finished. He pulled back the curtain of the physical world. Hear the word of the Lord, he bellowed. I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, with all the host of heaven standing around him. He described a divine council where the Lord asked, who will entice Ahab into attacking Ramoth-Gilead and going to his death there? After many suggestions, a spirit stepped forward. I will entice him, the spirit said. I will be a lying spirit in the mouths of all his prophets. You have succeeded, the Lord said. Go and do it. Micaiah pointed a bony finger at the 400. The Lord has decreed disaster for you, Ahab. These men are speaking with the breath of a lie. The silence following Micaiah's vision was shattered by a crack. Zedekiah, the man with the iron horns, lunged across the stone floor and struck Micaiah full in the face with an open palm. Dust flew from the impact. Micaiah's head snapped back, a trickle of blood appearing at the corner of his mouth. Which way did the spirit from the Lord go when it went from me to speak to you? Zedekiah demanded, his voice a manic shriek. Micaiah didn't flinch. He wiped the blood with a tattered sleeve, his eyes full of a terrifying pity. You will find out, he said quietly, on the day you run to hide in an inner room. Ahab had heard enough. The truth was an insult he could no longer tolerate. Take Micaiah, he barked to the guards. Put him in prison. Feed him nothing but bread and water until I return safely. Micaiah was seized, his arms pinned behind his back. As they dragged him toward the darkness of the dungeon once more, he threw one last look over his shoulder. It wasn't a look of fear, but of finality. If you ever return safely, Micaiah shouted, his voice echoing off the ivory walls, the Lord has not spoken through me. Mark my words, all you people. The iron doors slammed shut. Ahab stood on the threshing floor, the lying spirit already weaving its web around his heart. The drums of war began to beat. The sun rose over the valley, glinting off the spear points of two great armies. But Ahab was a man haunted. Micaiah's words, sheep without a shepherd, rang in his ears like a funeral bell. He looked at his royal robes and saw a target. I will enter the battle in disguise, Ahab told Jehoshaphat, his voice tight with a newfound cowardice. But you, wear your royal robes. It was a trap cloaked in a suggestion. Ahab hoped to hide from prophecy by looking like a commoner, while letting Jehoshaphat draw the fire of the Aramean elite. Jehoshaphat, bound by his word, agreed. Across the valley, the king of Aram gave a single, chilling order to his 32 chariot commanders. Do not fight with anyone small or great, except the king of Israel. The chariots roared to life, wheels churning the dry earth into a choking fog of dust. They ignored the foot soldiers. They ignored the archers. They searched only for a crown. They saw Jehoshaphat, tall in his saddle, his robes white and gold against the brown landscape. There, the commanders shouted, there is the king of Israel. They wheeled their teams, dozens of chariots converging on the lone king like wolves on a stag. Jehoshaphat realized too late the price of his alliance. He was surrounded, the tips of 32 spears leveled at his throat. The Aramean chariot commanders closed in like a tightening noose. Seeing the royal robes and the golden crown, they screamed their battle cry. The king of Israel, death to the king! Jehoshaphat felt the cold wind of 32 spears whistling toward his throat. He was trapped by his own compromise, draped in the very target Ahab had painted on his back. In that heartbeat between life and death, Jehoshaphat didn't reach for his sword. He reached for his God. Help me! He cried out. A raw, piercing scream that tore through the roar of the chariots. The Bible says the Lord helped him. God drew them away. As the commanders leveled their weapons, they looked into the eyes of the man in the saddle. They saw terror, they saw a man of Judah, but they did not see Ahab. He is not the king, the lead commander bellowed. Turn back! With a spray of gravel and a cacophony of shouting, the chariot swerved at the last possible second, leaving Jehoshaphat trembling in a cloud of dust. He was alive, but the battlefield was a chaotic graveyard. Ahab, watching from a distance in his common soldier's armor, breathed a sigh of relief. He had survived the elite guard. He had outsmarted the prophet. He was invisible, or so he thought. For while the king of Aram had missed his mark, the king of heaven had already released his. While the commanders hunted for a crown, a lone Aramean archer stood in the chaos. He didn't have a target. He wasn't aiming at a general or a king. He simply reached into his quiver, notched a common iron-tipped arrow, and drew his bow at a venture, at random. He let the string fly. The arrow hissed through the smoke, arching over the screaming men and the thundering hooves. It didn't strike a shield. It didn't hit a horse. Guided by an invisible hand, it found the only vulnerable inch in Ahab's entire defense, the narrow gap where the breastplate met the lower armor. The impact was a dull thud, followed by a sickening crunch of leather and bone. Ahab gasped, his lungs suddenly filling with fire. He looked down at the shaft protruding from his waist. The disguise had failed. The random arrow had found the man the elite guard could not. "Turn the chariot around," Ahab wheezed to his driver, blood beginning to soak through his common tunic. "Get me out of the battle, I am wounded." But the fight grew too fierce. The retreat was blocked by a wall of iron and flesh. Ahab was trapped in his own war, propped up in his chariot, facing the Arameans as the sun began to bake the blood onto the floorboards. The shepherd was struck. The sheep were about to scatter. The battle raged for hours, a relentless tide of bronze and blood. Ahab remained propped up in his chariot, a gruesome monument to a dying kingdom. He watched his soldiers fall. He watched the sun, a hateful red eye, begin to sink behind the hills of Samaria. With every jolt of the chariot, more life poured out of him. The floorboards were no longer wood. They were a pool of dark, sticky crimson. As the light faded, so did the king's strength. At sunset, the great cry went through the host, just as Micaiah had foreseen. "Every man to his city, every man to his own country." Ahab's head fell forward. The king was dead. The chariot, slick with the king's lifeblood, was driven back to Samaria. It was a funeral procession for a man who had tried to hide from God. They took the chariot to the pool of Samaria to wash away the evidence of the slaughter. As the water turned red, the stray dogs of the city crept out from the shadows. They began to lick the blood from the stone, the blood of the king who had murdered Naboth for a vineyard. The words of the prophets were no longer air, they were history. Every drop of blood licked by a dog was a seal on the justice of God. The ivory palace was silent. The 400 prophets had vanished into the inner rooms, their iron horns discarded and rusted in the dust. The manic energy of the threshing floor was replaced by the hollow echoes of a mourning nation. In Jerusalem, Jehoshaphat returned home, weary and slumped in his saddle. He had survived the spears of Aram, but he carried the weight of a heavy lesson. You cannot align with darkness and expect to walk in the light. He looked toward the north, toward the empty throne of Samaria, and remembered Micaiah's face, passive, pitying, and true. Micaiah remained in his cell, eating his bread of affliction, but he was the only man in the kingdom who was truly free. He had spoken the word, and the word had come to pass. The story of Ahab is not a story of a random arrow. It is the story of the empty throne. It is a reminder that kings may wear disguises, and prophets may wear rags, but the truth wears a crown that never fades. As the stars rose over the quieted hills of Gilead, the sheep had returned home. They were scattered, they were tired, but they finally knew the difference between a lying spirit and the living God. The war was over. The silence had returned.
If this story interests you, please hit the subscription button for more interesting stories. Coming up next is the measure of talent. Go back and subscribe now to know what happened in the next story.